Hey everybody, and welcome to This Week on Point North. I'm Alistair Stevens. It's Monday morning again. It's weird how these things roll around with such monotonous regularity, with such constant frequency, and yet we shall endure. We shall make it through Monday. We shall make it through Tuesday even. We shall make it through this week, and we shall once again arrive at the blessed respite of the weekend. I didn't have so much of a blessed respite this weekend, I have to say, because I was getting over some illness. I have been bearing this illness now for like a week, and then on Friday it decided, no, enough is enough. You can't actually just keep going forever. You have to stop and rest your voice and not podcast for a little bit, which meant wonderfully that I had Friday mostly off, but then I rescheduled the Shakespeare class to Sunday, which meant that yesterday was spent in the company of Richard III, which was just an absolute pleasure. It was a wonderful journey of discovery. As many of you know, many of you are enrolled in the Shakespeare class. Richard III is the play that we are discussing in the course of this class with which I am the least familiar. I know Much Ado About Nothing backwards and forwards. I know Othello backwards and forwards, but Richard III was the one that I was least familiar with, so I had the opportunity to spend just a lot of time yesterday plunging deep into that text and really appreciation for it, which is, I have to say, the pattern of my interaction with Shakespeare in general. In fact, it turns out that every time I plunge deep into Shakespeare, I am left with a new appreciation. I'm left with a new sense of depth and subtlety and complexity, and that awfully poised, brilliantly jagged kind of satirical intent, which is ambiguous enough that it can elude the casual reader, that it can be ambiguous, I have to say, but also is pointed enough that if you go looking for it, you can find it. It is just really, really powerful. Yeah, I should also start by thanking Aaron for sending me the Gravity Falls collected edition, which I meant to have here so that I could show you guys on camera, because it's a beautiful box set. But Aaron, to pick up from our discussion of Gravity Falls last week, sent me the complete series on DVD, which is wonderful. I've been watching a lot of Gravity Falls over the course of the weekend too. That show, you guys, that show is just magnificent. That show has a higher hit rate and a more consistent execution of, in particular, its high-level episodic concepts than basically any show that I can think of. I have also caught up just now with the last 5 episodes of Steven Universe, the most recent 5 episodes of Steven Universe, which is extraordinary. If you guys aren't up to date with Steven Universe, good luck, I suppose. It's very difficult to advise someone to go and watch all of Steven Universe because there is just so much of it. There are just so many episodes of that show now, even over the course of its 5 seasons. But it is well worth the journey, well worth the reading. But I'm not even thinking so much about Gravity Falls this morning. I'm not thinking so much about Shakespeare this morning, though I will have the opportunity to talk about Much Ado About Nothing on Friday. In the context of Shakespeare's comedies in the second phase of his career, the comedic phase of his career. Really what I'm thinking about this week, what I'm thinking about today, is Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, because this week we are going to start J.K. Rowling's 5th Harry Potter book, and I cannot wait. I have been launching myself back into this book with a great deal of force and a great deal of rapidity, and I have to say that I am thrilled at the prospect of discussing this book. I think this is a very difficult book. I think this is a very challenging book. It is in parts an absolutely heartbreaking book. It is difficult to read in a way that none of the preceding Harry Potter books have been difficult to read. This is, God, it's dark, you guys. It is so pitch black dark, and that starts right from the jump. We're going to have the opportunity to talk about that this week. We're also going to have the opportunity to talk about the expanding sense of the wizarding world. We're going to get to talk about Arabella Figg, and we're going to get to talk about Mundungus Fletcher, and we're going to get to talk about Aunt Petunia, and the revelation that she is more connected to the wizarding world than many people would have expected. This is a very rich vein of drama for J.K. Rowling, and she manages to do wonderful things with it. I also just rewatched the Order of the Phoenix movie, which I know gets a lot of general criticism, I think, which is fair, right? It falls between two stools, I would say. It isn't quite the self-contained and purposeful and propulsive kind of adaptation that we saw back in Prisoner of Azkaban, and even, we might argue, in parts of Goblet of Fire, but it also isn't the slavish, shallow recreation of the novel that we saw in Philosopher's Stone and Chamber of Secrets and in the other half of Goblet of Fire, right? It is something else. It is a stunningly beautiful film. That was what struck me most powerfully watching it again this time. Well, a number of things struck me powerfully watching it this time, which I'll talk about in the course of the Dear Mr. Potter sessions over the course of the next 20 weeks or however long it takes us to get through this giant and epic tome. But what really hit me watching it most recently was that it is just gorgeous. Every single shot, every single setup, every single location, it is beautiful. and everyone's had a haircut, which is really great coming off the end of Goblet of Fire. Like, everyone's had a haircut. We don't have to deal with Fred and George Weasley in their weird, what would you call that? Like a mid-90s kind of pulp aesthetic, right? To throw back to Goblet of Fire and our discussions of Jarvis Cocker, the lead singer of Pulp, who appears as the lead singer of the Weird Sisters, though never named in the movie, in Goblet of Fire. It's that kind of aesthetic that Fred and George are rocking throughout Goblet of Fire. And now here we are in a far more mature world, in a far darker world, and full credit to everyone in that cast for doing fantastic work. I will even say that Michael Gambon does better in Order of the Phoenix than he did in Goblet of Fire. I mean, as I've said before, not a big fan, but yes, yeah. Wilhelm Scream saying, by the time I read Dolores Umbridge as an American, I got a very Bush Cheney Patriot Act feel from it. I don't imagine that could have been Rowling's original intent. Any more specific info on that? No, not that specific intent, of course. She kind of anticipated that movement in American politics through the first decade of the 21st century, I suppose, but she is hearkening back to much older traditions. I mean, she's harking back to Neville Chamberlain, of course. She's going back to the rise of the Second World War, to the rise to power of Adolf Hitler. She's going back to the kind of compromises that good men make to allow evil to flourish, I suppose, right? That's the line that she's walking here. We're moving out of this very singular kind of discordant approach to prejudice and to bigotry, which has been so important and will continue to be important. I mean, let's not suggest for a moment that J.K. Rowling is going to set that primary theme aside in the rest of the Harry Potter books, but she's moving away from a primary focus on that kind of bigotry, on that kind of prejudice, to something that is more systemic, to something that is more institutional, which is, of course, entirely appropriate for this point of transition. We've been talking about this in the history of Harry Potter, even as early as Chamber, right? With the doubts that we are putting on the infrastructure of Hogwarts, and even the doubts that we are putting on the somewhat veiled and incompletely represented ministry. We're not completely going in that direction, but we're nodding toward it. We're gesturing toward it. Then, of course, in Prisoner, we get a full evocation of that. In Goblet, we get a heartbreaking delivery of that narrative potential, of that dramatic potential. And now here we are, just in a darker world. We are in, well, a world ruled by a tyrant, a world ruled by tyranny, not even just necessarily a tyrant, but the concept of tyranny itself. Order is going to be a tough book to read, but it is going to be an absolute delight to read in your fine company, of course. So we're going to do that on Tuesday. Jackie is in the process of moving from the West Coast to the East and is almost to Nevada. Jackie, I hope that your trip is going very well. I hope that you enjoy the East Coast. I hope that you have a wonderful time there. I know you're only there for a while, but I hope you make the most of it. And I have no idea, actually, what the weather was like where you were and what the weather was going to be like. I suspect there's going to be a rise in humidity, right? I suspect that you're going to have that experience. And if you find yourself passing through Oklahoma City, be sure to let me know. Yeah. Harry Potter and the Chamberlain of Appeasement, says Wilhelm Scream here. Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. This is, well, I mean, it's almost a take on Neville Chamberlain. It is in part, but it is also more than that. It is also more modern than that. It isn't just J.K. Rowling taking on history. There is, a lot of 1980s politics, 1980s British politics contained within Order of the Phoenix, which of course we would absolutely expect. And when I say 1980s, I really mean like late 70s through the 1980s. I'm talking about Margaret Thatcher. I'm talking about that rise of both lowercase c and uppercase c conservatism in British public life, in British political discourse. Certainly, there's a lot of that. There has been a lot of that throughout Harry Potter. It is impossible for J.K. Rowling to have grown up in the world that she grew up in, to have had the experiences that she had, and not reflect the tyrannical barbarism of Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. But, all of this, of course, we will discuss as we move through Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix over the course of the next 20 weeks. Let's do a quick gloss, in fact, of our week ahead. Let me pull this over here so I'm not tilting my head all the way over to the side here. And also, by the way, to continue our pickup from last week about how Adobe Creative Cloud is very, very good, but also very, very bad, I just got a slew of updates right before setting up everything for this week. So I had to scrabble to get everything in order so that we could actually have the classes linked out to by the post over on pointnorthmedia.com and the newsletter, of course. if this is the way that you get your information about what's to come from Point North Media, if you listen to the live broadcast, if you watch the live broadcast and join me, or you watch the video after the fact, or you download the podcast version of This Week on Point North, hey, you can also head on over to pointnorthmedia.com and click the This Week on Point North banner, where you will find a blog post with links out to the actual class pages. So if you want to listen to Dear Mr. Potter, you can go and click that button and it'll take you out to the live crowdcast page. All of that is set up every Monday morning before I sit down to do this fine show. So our journey begins here, of course, with This Week on Point North. Then this evening, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, we have the Patreon exclusive book club discussion for Dune. This is our 4th session looking at Frank Herbert's Dune. We are going to finish up the first book in Dune, and then we're going to move into book 2, Muad'Dib. We're going to talk a lot about prophecy. We're going to talk a lot about the interaction of prophecy and the conscious and deliberate making manifest of prophecy, I suppose, in terms of the Bene Gesserit. We're going to talk about the intersection between Paul as the Kwisatz Haderach and Paul as Muad'Dib, right? We're going to talk about what heroes are and how they work, how they function, particularly on Arrakis, which, as we discussed last week, is warfare made geography, right? This is what we learn from life on Arrakis, that it is hard and brutal and oppressive, and yet also for that liberating, right? These are not two opposed thoughts. These are combined thoughts. It is both of these things simultaneously because it is both of these things, if that makes sense. So we're going to talk about Dune at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central tonight. Tomorrow night, Dear Mr. Potter 62, Remember My Last. I've tried over the course of the last few weeks not to pull titles for the sessions that come from the very end of the reading, because I have made something of a habit of late of not making it through the entire reading. So I am setting myself a goal here. Remember My Last is, of course, the message that Aunt Petunia arrives. I won't spoil who that message comes from because it's not spoiled here at the beginning of the book, but that is the message that Aunt Petunia receives via Howler, of course, and that's right at the end of the reading. So I am now committing to covering the first 2 chapters of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix in this week's reading. I really am going to try and hold to that schedule, though, because it's going to be very easy to get into the weeds in Order of the Phoenix and end up taking, rather than the 20-some sessions that we're talking about, 30 sessions to talk about this book, which I think is just probably a little too long to spend in the company of Dolores Umbridge. So that is 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, tomorrow night. That is Tuesday, July the 17th. Then on Thursday evening, a brighter tone, a brighter spirit, a greater heart. Here we go. 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central on July the 19th. There and Back Again 70, The Return of the King. The King's back. He's returned. The line of the kings of Gondor and Arnor has been rebuilt, has been reconstituted, has been recrowned. Aragorn, son of Arathorn, King Elessar, is going to take the throne again, and then we're going to, well, pick up on a lot of outstanding subplots. We're going to have a great little beat between Gimli and Éomer that I'm looking forward to discussing a lot, where they talk about, hey, but which elf girl is the hottest? That's not what they're talking about. Like that's a casual and superficial and facile read of that sequence, but it is a great little scene. We're going to move into many partings, and we're going to start this descent back to, well, a kind of normalcy, though it is going to be a compromised and transformed kind of normalcy. We are never going to be able to go home. We are never going to be able to return from this journey back to the Shire as was. Even the Shire has been transformed. We'll talk about all of that when we get there, of course, but this week, picking up from the end of The Steward and the King and moving into many partings. It's going to be a really great read. That is on Thursday evening, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, There and Back Again 70, The Return of the King. And then, as I said, on Friday, for those of you who have signed up for the Globe's Bard Shakespeare class, we're going to be looking in our 3rd session at the comedies. We're going to be looking at the 2nd period of Shakespeare's playwriting. We're going to be looking at the rise of comedy, in effect, and the way in which Shakespeare, God, redefines and masters this form that is already very popular, that is already a very polished art form at this time. Shakespeare takes it still further, and then we're going to delve into the text of Much Ado About Nothing, which is probably my favorite Shakespeare play. Like hands down, probably my favorite Shakespeare play. So that is our list for this week, possibly with a story in Star Wars too, if, as I say, I can find the time to make all of that work, to get all of that done. Yeah, good. Let me see. Where are we here? Celebrity couple names as well. I'm screaming Gimladriel. Gimladriel is pretty good. Gimladriel is pretty good. Éomer, of course, refuses to acknowledge that Galadriel is the most beautiful person in the world, because he has looked upon Arwen. He has looked upon the Evening Star, and there is a great moment of reconciliation, which in classic Tolkienian fashion for this part of the book ends with this knife to the heart. It just ends with this tragic turn from Gimli, where Gimli too, even Gimli, son of Glóin, is oppressed by, well, the beginning of the Fourth Age, right? He is in full in full understanding of, I suppose, the decline of Middle Earth. It's tragic, it's gorgeous, it's powerful, but yeah, it's really lovely. Let me see here as I scroll back through. Wilhelm Scream saying, I finally located an old beat up paperback of Dune, and nope, if I open that, it's going to become a loose leaf folder. Time for a new copy. Yes, it really is. Oh, are we talking about The Last Jedi? Yes. Over at Can I Just Say from Common Room Radio, they recorded an episode about The Last Jedi just last night, which I myself am really looking forward to seeing, I have to say. Let me see. Aaron is asking, is Excelsior planning to reunite briefly for Ant-Man and the Wasp? I love that movie. It was refreshing to have some joy this summer. I am hoping so. Certainly that is the intent. However, I have not yet been to see Ant-Man and the Wasp. I haven't yet been to see Ocean's 8, and I feel like there was another movie that is out right now that I wanted to see, that I haven't had the opportunity to go and see. I've been very, very busy over the course of the last couple of weeks, you guys, and more importantly, of course, so has Vinton. His schedule right now is bananas. So yes, at some point we will get together to talk about Ant-Man and the Wasp. It's probably not going to be for a few weeks. It's probably not going to be soon, but yes, we're definitely eager to continue to talk about it. I have heard nothing but great things, so I'm very eager for it, and of course eager to look forward to Captain Marvel, about which I just hear fabulous things. Incredibles 2 is exactly it, Rohit. Thank you so much. Yes. Oh, and Wilhelm also anticipated that. You guys know my taste so well. Yes, it was Incredibles 2. I really wanted to go and see that too, but maybe I'll just take a day. Maybe I'll I don't know, maybe I'll skip work on Thursday or something and just go and hole up in the Dollar Movie Theater near here and just marathon all the films that I have to catch up on, right? And then I'll have some things to say about those movies when I sit down to record this week on Point North next week. I did actually wanting to speak about. That's how you formulate an English sentence. On the subject of Excelsior and on the subject of movie discussion to a certain extent and comics discussion, certainly. One of the things that I want to do here at the beginning of the week with This Week on Point North is talk about some of the people that I support and talk about some of the podcasts that I listen to and that I really enjoy. And this week we're going to begin with a hearty recommendation for 3 different podcasts. In fact, all of which are unified by the presence of one Chris Sims. Aaron, I know, is already a huge fan. I think, Aaron, this is how I don't think this is how we met, but I do think this is how I understood that it was you, that you were the same person who had popped up in some of the commentary with was it the Xena podcast? I think it may have been. No, probably the Sailor Moon podcast, right? Anyway. Chris Sims, Matt D. Wilson produce a podcast called War Rocket Ajax, which is the internet's most destructive comic book and pop culture podcast, as they introduce it every week. It is a really great show. Every week they do maybe 20 minutes to a half hour of general chat and comics reviews and comics recommendations. And then generally they will interview a creator. They will have an extended interview with a comic book writer, a comic book artist, with someone who is working in the comic book field. And they are always delightful. They are always positive. They are generous and really quite charming. And I recommend War Rocket Ajax a great deal if you're looking for something to fill that Excelsior gap, particularly vis-a-vis comic books over the summer. Go check out War Rocket Ajax. Chris Sims also produces 2 other podcasts. He produces the Sailor Business podcast with Marvel editor Jordan D. White, where they do an episode by episode recap podcast for the 1992 Sailor Moon anime. I like Sailor Moon a great deal. I actually quite like the 1992 anime quite a lot. And Sailor Business is just great. It is, again, joyous and ludicrous and willful and insightful in part, and also just absurd and lunatic. It is really great. You should definitely go and check that out. And if you're in the mood for another rewatch podcast, you can go and check out Xena Warrior Business, which is the show that Chris Sims does with Alison Stock about Xena Warrior Princess, which is also great. So you can go and catch up with both of those, with all 3 of those podcasts. In fact, I support both War Rocket Ajax and the Asterisk Business Podcast Empire, I suppose, over on Patreon. So you can go and listen to those shows and pledge your support too. Angela saying that she needs to catch up with Ajax, and Aaron saying, yeah, I like the Chris Sims over quite a bit. I think this is how you connected this username with my personal name, perhaps. I think it probably is, actually. Yes, I think it probably is. Wilhelm Scream saying, oh, by the way, I'd like to recommend the Freeform series Cloak and Dagger, a real pleasant surprise. I cannot believe that Cloak and Dagger has been released already. I cannot believe that show just came out. Cloak and Dagger, you guys, they are in no way important to most people, but they're very important to me, right? They're very important to my love of comic books from the late 1980s and early 1990s. I adore Cloak and Dagger. I haven't seen a second of the show yet. So yeah, I'm just, someday I'll have time to catch up with everything that I need to catch up with. And on that day, I will launch 17 new podcasts and you guys will just be lost. Yeah, good. And Caroline recommending Cloak and Dagger too. Angela also recommending a Cloak and Dagger and saying that it has a Runaways vibe. Runaways is extremely good. Caroline also recommending Versailles is really good. Oh, Sailor Melissa is asking, who did the Last Jedi podcast, CRR? I don't see it yet in iTunes. I don't think it's going to drop for another hour or so. Maybe it might even be a little bit later in the day. I'm not entirely sure of the editing schedule for that, but it will come out from the podcast, Can I Just Say, later this afternoon. It's going to be real good. Yeah. Yeah, Becca's recommending Versailles Season 3. Wow, that's... Yeah, I'm... oh, and Elizabeth is confirming Daphne is editing the Last Jedi podcast. It should be up later tonight. Excellent, excellent. And Skipa is joining us. Hey, Skipa, how are you doing? You're joining us for the last 10 minutes of the session, I suppose. If you guys have recommendations of other artists, of other podcasts, of other video producers, of other, you know, writers, anyone that you support on the internet, not necessarily through Patreon, right? If through Patreon, then great. If not through Patreon, then just let me know. I'm always looking for new artists, for new writers, for new commentators, for new critics. I mean, we're coming out of a really tough week here in the Star Wars fandom after the long-awaited demise of Rebel Force Radio, which I'm not optimistic enough to think has gone away forever, but has certainly taken its hits over the course of the last week. This is all part of the ongoing problem of rampant toxicity in the Star Wars community, though, of course, it was lovely to see last week parts of that Star Wars community start to band together and reclaim the space, start to, well, you know, one's up, right? They're starting to reject the darkness of the toxicity that has surrounded particularly The Last Jedi, but we must not be naive. We must not pretend that this toxic response to Star Wars began with The Last Jedi. It absolutely didn't. You can go back and look at Rogue One, definitely. A Star Wars movie with a female protagonist? How very dare you, sir? You can go back and look at Rogue One. You can go back and look at The Force Awakens. You can go back and look at all the promotional material leading up to The Force Awakens. God, guys, it's a mess. It's a mess. And it's a mess because we value too much. And I say we, I don't mean us here. I mean, we as a shared culture, we value too much noise and clamor and fury. We have somehow ended up in a position where we think that righteous anger is righteous, where we somehow think that the person who is most aggressive, the person who has the biggest feels has a right to a platform, which just isn't true. We used to value considered critique. We used to, and again, I'm maybe being a little naive here and a little golden age about this, but it feels to me that we used to value a different kind of critique and a different kind of audience response. And this is not to suggest that we ought to go back to the days of gatekeepers, right? One of the reasons that we had a more civil and reasonable and informed critique back in the 1980s was that we had Siskel and Ebert reviewing movies. We had Leonard Maltin reviewing movies, telling us what to think about films, which is great because those guys are very experienced and very wise and very informed and capable of expressing themselves in an accessible and yet profound fashion. We have removed the gatekeeper impediments on these discussions around this discourse, which is great because everyone should have a voice. I'm not arguing for a second in favor of gatekeepers, but when we burn down gatekeepers, when we burn down the gates that these gatekeepers were keeping, when we liberated the discourse in the age of the internet, we didn't take the best lessons from what was available before. Yes, so many voices were marginalized. So many voices were utterly repressed, right? There were so many voices, important, crucial voices that were absent from the discourse entirely because they didn't belong to middle-aged white men, basically, right? Those voices need a platform. They need to be heard, but that doesn't mean that we can simply engage in this clamor and discord, that we can engage in this shouting match, that we can take these things so personally. We still need to elevate the way in which we discuss art, the way in which we discuss culture, the way in which we discuss society, the way in which we discuss politics. There is a race to the bottom right now in terms of public discourse that only serves those who are already in power, right? It is never a rebellious act to drag the discourse into the gutter because the gutter is where these guys live. I refer you to Donald Trump's Twitter account, right? That is the ne plus ultra example of this kind of discourse. We can't allow the discourse to be dragged into the gutter. We have to elevate it. We have to prop it up. We have to do what we can, each of us, to lift this canvas and create this tent, right? We need to create a space for everyone to talk in a respectful and responsible and genuine, still authentic, still honest, still angry sometimes fashion, but not to reduce the tone and the tenor and the quality of this discourse. It is just too damn important for that. Let me see here. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Becca saying, can we take a minute to be sad that most of the Pride Month goodness was kept away from the folks in Russia? It makes me sad. Yeah. I mean, and so many other places in the world, Becca, you're right. It's so easy. And this is the problem, right? This is why it's so difficult. Should we claim Pride Month as a victory? Hell yes, we should claim Pride Month as a victory. It is so important. It is so fantastic, but it is not the end game. It is not the certificate of completing your course of studies, right? It is not. The battle has not been won, or the war certainly has not been won. Even Pride, even in this country, there are protests, there are counter-protests, there are counter-parades. We need to elevate. We need each and every one of us to step the hell up in terms of our cultural discourse, which is, relatively speaking, unimportant, right? That is just not significant. Talking about art, talking about TV shows, talking about comic books, talking about movies, talking about novels, this is not like important in the grand scheme of stuff, except that it acts as a beacon. And if everyone who is passionate about their area of study can light that beacon, can elevate their discourse, can be inclusive, and can allow, can create opportunities, I mean, in my case in particular, right, as a middle-aged white man, oh God, I'm 40, I'm middle-aged now. As a middle-aged white man, like, part of my job is to step the hell back from the microphone and to let other people speak, not to try and control that discourse, not to try and dictate, or worse still, to co-opt that discourse and use it as a means of demonstrating how cool and great I am. That is terrible and toxic and reductive and awful. Like, my job is to shut up and to stop talking sometimes, to let other voices be heard, not that I am empowering those voices, except in the degree that I have an audience. And if I can share, or I can retweet, or I can recommend, then I will do exactly that thing. That is the burden that is placed, the burden, that is the duty that is placed upon me. I'll use the less loaded word there. And it's a duty that I absolutely value and want to fulfill at every opportunity. This has turned dark, you guys. It's a little bit dark here on this Monday morning. All of that is to say that this week, when you go forth into the world, when you were talking about the things that matter most to you, when you were talking about, when Becca's talking about history, or Aaron is talking about Gravity Falls, or the podcast works about Chris Sims, the podcast works of Chris Sims, or Never Tell Me the Pods, Aaron is recommending here, which was a Star Wars discussion focused on inclusion and minority views, but it doesn't update very much these days. Oh, that's too bad. The pod fading is still a real issue. Yeah, it's tough, you know. Oh, and okay, Cyrano de Bergerac is saying here, I think a lot about what you said, Alistair, about how we spend so much time trying to rationally defend the goodness of a thing rather than accept that what compels us does not need to be objectively good. I think the righteous anger comes from people trying to make objective arguments about something intrinsically subjective and claim that their preference is representative of some kind of moral high ground, something my scientist heart facepalms over. Cyrano, you are absolutely right. That is a huge problem in this kind of toxic discourse, is the mistaking of the subjective for the objective. You are completely right. But there is also tied up in that, particularly with regard to like Star Wars, and particularly tied up with this kind of toxic masculinity, right? There's a problem with the confusion of subjective art with identity. We don't want Star Wars to change, because if Star Wars changes, then we are not who we thought we were, right? We don't want Luke Skywalker, who was a symbol to us of the kind of person that we can be when we grow up. We don't want Luke Skywalker to fall into darkness and to fall into shadow, or even to fall into doubt. We certainly don't want him to not be the hero of the piece, because that says something about us. The art that you love is not your identity. The stories that you tell are not your identity. They are a part of your identity, but your identity is more resilient than that. It is more true than that. And your identity is only empowered by being opened up. It is only made more beautiful and precious and vital and valuable by being opened up to other identities, to celebrating not the monolithic individual, right? Not the simple and singular presence of self, that singular identity that you feel defines you imperfectly, because we all have imperfect appreciations of our own identity and our own internal nature. We're not talking about the value of this monolithic identity. The monolithic identity is quite simply not that valuable. Identities are valuable when they act in concert, when we have this web of connectivity. We are only defined in this Socratic ideal, right? We are best defined when we are interacting with someone else in that crossover Venn diagram space. So having more conversations and talking more freely, more generously, more kindly, and listening more carefully, more assiduously, this is of vital importance. Yeah, guys, this is time, I'm afraid. This kind of took a turn. I'm sorry. This is, yeah, maybe go for a walk, grab a donut, see an amazing movie with the matinee, says Aaron. That's really good advice. Oh, and Rohit is saying, speaking of that, you mentioned a few months ago a plan to highlight the voices of women and people of color in discussion of Harry Potter and Tolkien. Is that still happening? Yes, very much. I would really like to do this. The problem is, well, the two problems are A, time, and B, logistics. It's a very challenging thing to try and arrange, and it's a thing that is kind of outside of my skill set. What I need to do is talk to some people who are more familiar with this kind of round table discourse, I suppose, and do that. In the meantime, I can absolutely advocate for you following Can I Just Say over at Common Room Radio. You know, the voices of incredibly smart women talking about the pop culture that we love. It's amazing and beautiful. And I will be listening to their Last Jedi show as it comes out tonight. Yeah. Okay, that is going to do it, you guys. It is time. Let me very quickly run through all of this. Obviously, this evening, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, the patron-exclusive book club, part 4 of our discussion of Dune, finishing up book 1, Dune, moving into book 2, Muad'Dib. The naming convention is weird in Dune. It's totally fine. We're going to talk about that tonight, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central. Tomorrow, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, Dear Mr. Potter 62, Remember My Last, the first 2 chapters of Order of the Phoenix. Thursday, 10 p.m. Central, 10 p.m. Eastern at 9 p.m. Central, There and Back Again 70, The Return of the King. Speaking of hope, speaking of elevating the rhetoric, speaking of elevating the discourse, speaking of courtesy and kindness and gentility, here we are. We're going to crown Aragorn, son of Arathorn. He's going to get married. It's going to be really great. There's a lot to talk about in those chapters. So that is taking place 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central. Thursday evening, that is July 19th. And then for those of you who are registered for the Shakespeare class, Friday evening, 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central, the Globes Bard Session 3, in which we talk about the comedies, we talk about the second phase of Shakespeare's life, and we talk about Much Ado About Nothing. That is going to do it, though, for this week on Point North. Guys, go forth, have a fantastic Monday, have a great week, talk to the people who bring you joy, ignore the people who don't bring you joy, live your best possible life, and wands up, you guys. I'll talk to you all again very soon. Until then, take care.